Chapter 5, Act 5, The Prince's Tale. Act 5, The Prince's Tale. The Guardian. The hooded man knew that his mouth was hanging open and that his eyes were wide with awe, but he made no effort to control himself. He couldn't tell if the dull roar in his ears was from the steadily increasing wind, or from all of the blood making a rush from the rest of his body to his head. Crossing his arms over his chest, he took another long look at Theodore, shivering and pale in the storm's wake. Of course. Why didn't I see it sooner? Theodore folded his hands together, still staring at his feet.
What's wrong? I know I lied by omission. Even after all you've done for me. I didn't know what else to do. I was scared.
The hooded man blinked. Oh, of course. That would be the conclusion he would come to, wouldn't it? He regained his senses, turning away and shaking his head hurriedly.
No, nothing. Nothing is wrong.
Theodore nodded slowly, a strange release of calm from having finally confessed mixing with the desperation to find his parents that was clawing at his insides, about to tear a hole in his stomach. He glanced at the overlook once more, and realized that his mind must have been playing tricks on him from the stress of finally arriving home. He could no longer see scorch marks, and the castle was as silent as when they had arrived. The only screams had been those in his own mind. Theodore took a deep breath, looking up at the hooded man. He had to find Cecil and Rosa first, then he could explain everything.
I'm going ahead to check up on them,
he declared, pushing his soaked hair out of his eyes.
I'll be back soon.
Wait! The hooded man cried, whirling back around to face Theodore, who had already pivoted to start running in the other direction. Theodore paused.
What is it?
The hooded man raised his eyebrows, gesturing to the emptiness of the castle.
Watch yourself.
Theodore nodded.
I will.
And with that, he fled, disappearing through the doorway in the western tower ahead of them, the door banging wildly on its hinges as Theodore plowed through it. As the hooded man watched him go, Anja cleared her throat. The hooded man turned to face Megan and Anja. He realized he had totally forgotten about them ever since the four of them had entered the castle. Both mages were standing on either side of the waterway entrance, staring at him with their arms crossed over their chests.
What is it?
Megan looked away guiltily.
Our mission was only to accompany you on your way to Baron.
The hooded man nodded.
That's right.
Anja shook her head.
Something bad is brewing as we speak. I'm sorry, but we need to bring word of this crisis to my city,
Megan added. The man turned away.
Well, thanks. I appreciate the help you gave me. Give Lady Porum my regards.
Megan and Anja looked at each other as if to say
whose regards,
and wordlessly took their leave. Just as the waterway gate screeched closed behind them, an exhausted groan drifted across the courtyard, reaching the hooded man's ears.
Ugh!
Someone's voice. I can barely hear it. It's not Theodore's. He turned back toward the courtyard to gain his bearings. To his left, there was a doorway that, if he looked closely, appeared to be splashed with the remains of something deep red, like blood. Directly in front of him, there was the entrance to the westernmost tower of the castle that Theodore had started to climb, and to the northeast, there was an entryway that took you to the overlook high above. Closest to his right was another door that had to have led into the heart of the castle. I guess I'll take door number 1, with the obvious bloodstain. Whether it's human or monster, I suppose I'll find out shortly. Pulling his waterlogged hood closer over his head, he jogged over to the door, pulling it open with little effort. It had not been locked or barred in any way. Climbing down a long set of stairs, he found himself in a prison, consisting of 3 massive cells that were all locked with no sign of the keys anywhere. Inside each cell were at least several soldiers in dragoon armor, all passed out on the floor and in widely varying condition, ranging from some appearing to just be sleeping peacefully to others who were obviously long dead.
Hey!
The man cried, pulling out his blade and using the handle to rattle the bars on the cells.
Can anyone hear me?
But there came no reply. If the moan he had heard was coming from the prison, the person it belonged to wasn't going to wake up anytime soon. He traveled down to the other cells, trying to get a reaction, but having no luck. He sheathed his sword, backing away and shaking his head. They must be under some sort of spell. Which means Theodore is in danger. I need to hurry, before whatever did this to these soldiers comes after him. The hooded man fled the prison, panting for breath as he tried to decide where to go next. The doorway to the western tower had been tightly shut, and now the doorway to the castle keep was wide open, creaking back and forth in the wind. Surely if Theodore were looking for his parents, the next place he would try would be the throne room. He must have been unsuccessful in the tower. He decided to follow Theodore's path and see where he ended up. He ran through the door he suspected the prince had disappeared within, running up another flight of stairs and finding himself in the suspiciously empty great hall.
Theodore!
The hooded man called cautiously, not too anxious to draw attention to himself. However, no one replied, so he proceeded with sprinting north and entering the next room. He stopped short as he crossed the threshold, his heart leaping into his throat when he saw what was waiting for him on the other side. On each side of the room, which had been divided into 2 chambers before leading to yet another door, there was a line of yet more dragoons, staring listlessly ahead. But even though the man had been obvious in his entrance, none of them swiveled their heads or turned to look at him. He took a few steps forward, not wanting to openly reach for his blade in case one of them snapped out of it and perceived him as a threat. Every single soldier's eyes were black as the night, and lacking any semblance of life within. Their faces were pale, just like the guards who had refused Theodore entry to the castle, and their lips tinted a deep purple. Poison? Or something else? The hooded man paused in front of one of the soldiers, trying to elicit any kind of physical or verbal response. It gave him no pause that every single one had at least one blade hanging from their hips. He wondered if they could even lift them, they looked so sickly and benumbed.
Hello?
The man asked.
Are you okay? Your orders, my liege.
The soldier replied back in a monotone. He blinked.
My orders. Your orders, my liege. What the hell is going on?
He breathed, taking a few steps back. The soldier continued to stare ahead, not bothering to stop him. Theodore. The hooded man pushed ahead into the antechamber. It was empty, but if he looked closely, he could see wet footsteps embedded in the rich red carpets, and they looked small enough to be Theodore's. Pushing open the final set of doors, he found himself in the Baronian throne room. The red carpet continued up the center of the room, leading to a small flight of stairs and a raised platform that contained the silk-embroidered and golden-gilded throne of King Cecil of Baron. Draped along the northern walls were Baron's banner and swaths of crimson and violet curtains that were layered elegantly and tied back from the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows with golden threaded tassel tiebacks. Matching golden candle stands as tall as a man lined the aisleway that led to the throne, each lit with 3 ivory, tapered candles. Because of the raging storm outside, the candles provided the only light in the entire chamber, casting long, twitching shadows that made the hooded man flinch with each hesitant step he took forward. He had the unsettling feeling that he wasn't alone. And he didn't think Theodore was in there with him. There was an abrupt crack of lightning outside, briefly illuminating the throne room with a blinding light. Then came the footsteps, calmly and steadily crossing the cold stone floor of the raised platform the throne sat upon. An unsettling creak of armor filled the air as a figure appeared from behind one of the curtains, half draped in the flickering shadows of the candlelight. A distant, haughty voice called out.
You are.
The hooded man did not answer right away, biding his time. The figure moved closer, and he watched as a pale, elegant hand with a wrist wrapped in ivory bracers draped itself over the top of the throne, sliding down to trace the gilding as the figure emerged from the shadows and took a seat. It was undoubtedly King Cecil. The hooded man could immediately place the similarities between him and Prince Theodore. Had he seen the king any time recently, he was quite positive that he would have been able to identify Theodore upon their initial meeting. Both had the same alabaster complexion, the same slender, slightly upturned nose, and King Cecil was even tilting his head similarly to Theodore as he pressed his fingers against his temple, silently and fluidly crossing one leg over the other as he settled back in the throne. But it was their eyes that would have been the dead giveaway, the deep, fearless, blue pools that could be frightfully intimidating if turned upon a stranger. But curiously, where Theodore's eyes had been filled with determined light, even when he had been filled with terror, Cecil's were cold, and dark, glaring so deeply that the man felt as if he were shackled in place by invisible chains. It had become impossible to look away, even if he wanted to. He had been drawn into them, like a kitchen pest lured into a baited trap. But despite the resentful glare of the king, the hooded man could not help but break into a small smile when he saw Cecil. He hadn't expected the relief in his heart to be quite so evident, and had the situation not been quite as dire, he might have even been compelled to let out a little cheer under his breath.
You're all right.
I wasn't too late after all. Cecil raised one perfectly arched eyebrow, pressing his lips together.
Of course I am. I need to be if Baron is going to continue keeping the peace in this world.
The man's face fell, his smile withering away. Surely this wasn't just King Cecil being wary of a stranger who had somehow managed to infiltrate his security. There was something mechanical and controlled about the tone of his voice, it had never fluctuated even once. The darkness in his eyes had become even more pronounced, not even the candlelight was reflected within. The man shook his head slowly, reaching up to pull down his hood. Suddenly, the chill that had been in his bones from the waterway and the storm had become replaced with a stifling, suffocating heat. There was something about the atmosphere of the throne room that made him feel as if he were descending into a hellish pit.
You've changed. Do I know you?
Cecil frowned, watching as the man's hood fell back from his face. It was the first flicker of emotion the man had been able to pick up on from him, confusion. The man pushed the damp locks of hair away from his face, saying nothing as he locked eyes with the king. For a few tense moments, the room was silent as they stared at each other, even the storm outside had gone dormant. Cecil was the first to look away, closing his eyes and crossing his arms over his chest.
If you're just a stray beggar, then please leave immediately. I am a very busy man.
The hooded man turned away, clenching his jaw as he reached back and pulled the hood over his face once more.
Pardon me.
He turned and walked away, not pausing once to glance back at the king for fear at what it was he would see. Just as the door leading to the antechamber slid shut behind him, Cecil slumped down slightly in his throne, a seizing pain ripping through his left temple as he screwed his eyes shut, clenching his head in his hands.
Ugh. Who?
The dragoon soldiers continued to ignore the hooded man as he retraced his steps back into the great hall. To his surprise, he saw Theodore running in at the same time from the eastern wing of the castle, his face flushed from exertion. Spotting his comrade, Theodore ran to him, gasping for breath and shaking his head.
There's no one here. There were a bunch of soldiers guarding the throne room, but none of them would even look at me. They let me in, but no one was there, either.
The hooded man frowned. So, Cecil must have made his appearance after Theodore had searched the throne room. Intentional or not, it had perhaps been a blessing in disguise. It would be better for Theodore if he didn't see Cecil in his current state. The look in the boy's eyes when we first entered the castle. I don't know if he'd be able to handle it or understand. Hell, I don't even understand what's going on right now. And with that, the hooded man decided to play along with Theodore's findings, or lack thereof. What was most critical at that point was getting Theodore as far away from the castle as possible. If Theodore knew Cecil was here, that would become impossible.
Yeah. Looks that way.
Theodore looked down, and the hooded man could see he was doing his best not to let himself cry. His eyes were rimmed with red, but the tears did not come.
Did the monsters get them all?
The hooded man looked away.
Looks to be that way. I couldn't even find Sid's airship, the Enterprise.
The hooded man raised his eyebrows. That was a bit of good news he wasn't expecting.
You didn't? Let's just pray he got out safely. Perhaps the others are with him as well.
Theodore nodded, his mouth set in a straight line.
Let's hope so. Where are Megan and Anja?
The man rested his hand on Theodore's shoulder.
They have returned to Mysidia. They were anxious to report to Porum what has transpired, unfortunately. But now is not the time for you and me to dawdle. Let's get out of here, and we can gather our thoughts elsewhere.
Theodore merely nodded, and despondently began to lead them out. When they reached the front gates of the castle, Theodore pushed the doors open, giving the soldiers that were guarding the gate a scare.
How did you get in here? Leave now.
One of the soldiers barked, and Theodore rolled his eyes.
Yeah. We're leaving. Keep your helmets on.
In the same meadow that they had discussed their plans to break into the castle, Theodore and the hooded man huddled out of earshot of the guards. The rain had stopped, but the hooded man feared they were merely in the eye of the storm. The rushing clouds in the distance told him that more was yet to come, and it would be upon them sooner rather than later.
So, what are you planning to do now?
He asked Theodore. Theodore looked up at him, his hands on his hips.
I've already decided. I'm going to look for the Enterprise. There is no way Sid would leave without my parents, his loyalty to my family is absolute. I'm sure if I find the Enterprise, I'll find them. Is that right?
Theodore nodded.
What about you? You said you had urgent business in Baron, right?
The hooded man frowned, Cecil's cutting glare flashing before his eyes. Yes. It probably would be for the best if he remained in Baron. He still had not achieved his objective.
Guards. To me, at once.
3 soldiers burst into the throne room, each taking a sweeping bow before Cecil. He had risen from his throne, and was pacing erratically with his hand pressed to his mouth. The guards took no note of this strange behavior, merely keeping their heads bowed.
Your orders, my liege.
Cecil finally paused, lowering his hand and clenching it into a fist at his side.
There was an uninvited guest right here earlier. I don't know how he got in, but...
He shook his head, trying to fend off another spasm of throbbing pain that he could feel making its way first through his chest, then his jaw. Ever since that man had arrived, something ghastly had awoken inside of him.
Your orders, then.
The soldiers droned in unison. Cecil cursed under his breath in lieu of a cry as his head was racked once more by the ache that felt as if someone was taking a chisel to his skull. He angrily kicked a candle stand over and crushed it under his foot, the candles fortunately blowing out as they flew through the air before breaking in half on the stone floor. Even this out-of-character act did not stir the soldiers to any kind of action.
I have never met the man before, but there was something about him.
Cecil drew in a sharp breath.
Go after him. The Kingdom of Baron must protect the world's peace, and that man is a threat to our mission. Whether he is brought back dead or alive makes no difference to me. The same goes for anyone aiding him as well. Understood, Your Majesty.
The 3 guards stood back up, and filed out of the throne room wordlessly, the door slamming behind them. Cecil collapsed back into his throne, letting out a strangled sigh as his hair fell in his eyes, blanketing him in darkness. Theodore stared up at the hooded man, anxiously awaiting his reply. A reluctant, disappointed part of his heart knew that it was only going to be a matter of time before the two of them needed to part ways. Their shared objective of arriving at Baron had come and gone, and there was nothing left for Theodore in his hometown anymore. He had already started plotting in his head what he would try to do. He had decided that the best way to find the Enterprise would be with another airship, but there was no hope of him accessing any of the extra airships in Baron. They had all seemingly disappeared when he conducted his search along the castle grounds. Either they were hidden away, or someone had taken them. There was, however, a harbor out east that he could use, as long as he could find a ship. If he could convince a sailor in the village to take him out to sea, he could sail to Agart and find an entrance to the underworld, where he knew King Jut of the dwarves held an airship, the Falcon. Theodore had never been to the underworld, but he knew Jut was a close friend of his father's, and his daughter Princess Luca happened to also be Sid's apprentice. He had little doubt that if he asked, he would be allowed to borrow the Falcon to find his family. I have to do this, even if it means going at it alone. The villagers seem all right for now. If I can bring my parents home, they can break the spell over those soldiers and bring the castle back to normal. Theodore's stomach clenched as the reality of the deceased Red Wings really hit him, now that he was back in his homeland and could see how their absence for just 2 days had allowed this much chaos to breed. If something else happens while my parents are gone, I won't be able to defend Baron by myself. And I don't know if the soldiers left at the castle would help. I'll need allies. The hooded man cleared his throat.
Theodore.
Theodore realized if the man had answered his question, he hadn't heard it, he had been too deep in thought. He followed his gaze, and saw that a group of soldiers were coming out of the front gates of the castle, conversing with the 2 that were standing guard. One of the guards pointed toward the meadow where Theodore and the hooded man were ensconced, and the soldiers nodded and began to walk in their direction.
Looks like our stay here has been cut short,
the hooded man said, and Theodore blinked.
Hey? You think they're after us?
He nodded, recalling his stilted conversation with Cecil. Whatever was going on with him, he wouldn't recognize Theodore, he was sure of it. With Theodore being the only accounted for member of the Baronian royal family, there was no way he could stay here and possibly remain safe. The best case scenario was that he would be thrown into the prison to rot with the dragoons. And the worst would be...
Come on, let's go. Go where?
Theodore gasped, mentally picturing the perfect plan he had come up with already unraveling like a ball of string bouncing down a flight of stairs. The man grabbed his arm, jerking him forward.
Our final destination is northwest. To Mist Cave. We'll cut through the Chocobo forest in the south to lose them and get some more distance between us by catching one to ride on. Hurry.
He began to run, dragging Theodore behind him. Theodore cried out as he stumbled, struggling to gain his footing in the slippery grass. He could hear the soldiers starting to catch up to them, shouting to each other.
There. They're getting away. No.
Theodore cried, taking a deep breath and yanking his arm away from the hooded man so he could run on his own.
Why? Watch out, Theodore.
The man said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a bomb crank, a small, mummified arm from a slain bomb monster that was shriveled and black, with only a few traces of the original red color of its flesh left. He tossed it behind them, and the meadow, despite being drenched from the rain, instantly lit up into a wall of flames, blocking their pursuers from coming any closer, for now. Theodore glanced back as the flames lit the storm-tinged sky. He could hear the soldiers giving up and turning back toward the castle. The fire must have weakened them too badly to keep up their pursuit. As they continued to run, Baron got smaller and smaller behind them, and Theodore could only bring himself to look away when it had completely disappeared over the hilly horizon.
Through here, Theodore,
the man instructed, sprinting toward a small forest. Theodore redoubled his efforts, catching back up to the man and bursting through the darkened, humidity-logged trees. Their footsteps grew quieter as they started trampling rotting leaves and blankets of pine needles, and soon the hooded man slowed down, pressing his finger to his lips as they approached a clearing. Theodore saw a chocobo, a massive, yellow-colored bipedal bird with shiny black eyes and a sharp orange beak, perfect for harvesting greens from the ground, napping in the clearing, its head tucked under one wing as it snored away, oblivious to its new visitors. If you were very good at riding chocobos, one could normally catch one in the wild and ride it without a saddle or a pair of reins. Even wild chocobos would generally defer to humans when caught and would simply just return home to their forest after they were released. But Theodore had never caught a wild chocobo in his life. Any he had ever ridden were already wrangled for him and presented to him with proper riding equipment. He glanced at the hooded man, who had an uncharacteristically wicked smile on his face as he crept closer and closer into the clearing. Launching himself into a front handspring, the man threw himself at the chocobo, encircling his arms around its neck and landing with his legs surrounding the bird's abdomen, bending into a squat so that he didn't crush its spine as he came down. The chocobo squawked and lifted its head, looking around confusedly as it shot up on its legs. The man bounced into the air and laughed, patting the chocobo's head and scooting up closer to its elongated neck so that there was room behind him.
Well, that was easier than expected. I haven't done that in years. Hop on, Theodore.
Theodore frowned.
I can't do that whole.
He made a circling motion with his wrist and fingers.
Jumping thing. Just give it a try.
The man turned, patting the chocobo's rear.
Don't worry, you won't hurt it. This bird is far sturdier than you or I. Chocobos are going to be on our planet long after humans have run each other through.
Well, that's a little morbid. Theodore sighed, inhaled deeply, and took a running leap. He knew he had jumped far too late. As soon as his feet left the forest floor, he went sailing over the chocobo and crashed into a pile of brush instead. The hooded man burst out laughing as Theodore surfaced, his whole body aching as he yanked twigs and slimy leaves out of his hair. Theodore turned red, tossing the roughage aside and stomping out of the brush.
Is this really the time to be joking? I'm sorry.
The man shook his head, looking away so that Theodore couldn't see his failing efforts to stop the laughter from bubbling out.
It's just... You reminded me so much of a friend of mine right then. He couldn't mount a chocobo to save his life either. We even had a bet when we were around your age. He lost and had to let me pierce his ear. Hee hee. The look on his face when I came at him with a cactuar needle. I'll never forget it.
Theodore's hands defensively flew up to his own pierced ears, scowling. The man let out a deep, content sigh, allowing himself one last chuckle.
It wasn't stylish back then like it is now. I guess you had to be there.
As a consolation, he gave the chocobo a gentle nudge with his foot, and the bird lowered itself so that Theodore could climb aboard. Theodore felt his anger evaporate as he hauled himself onto the chocobo and clutched onto the hooded man's cape. The bird let out a cheerful whark and started to rise and sprint forward out of the forest. Theodore had realized that the man was probably trying to lighten the mood after witnessing the disastrous state of Baron, and the story he had just let slip was the most he had ever revealed about himself to Theodore. Maybe he's starting to trust me, even though I lied about who I was, Theodore thought. I'll apologize to him properly once we've made it to Mist Cave. The rain began to come down again as they emerged from the forest and sprinted up north toward the mountain range Mist Cave was tucked away in. Theodore couldn't temper his paranoia, thinking he heard soldiers behind them every few yards and found himself constantly swiveling his head as they rode. However, the fields behind them were abandoned, not even the local neighborhood monsters that still occasionally appeared to hassle travelers were out in this weather.
What's in Mist Cave?
Theodore finally asked, turning his attention to the looming mountains that were getting closer and closer. Long ago, the cavern had acted as a gateway to the kingdom of Damsion by a mist, a sleepy village to the north that Theodore knew was once home to summoners, humans who could call monsters from a phantom plane, eidolons, to their side in battle. The hooded man looked over his shoulder. Theodore.
A place for us to hide and give us some time to think about our next steps. I'm sorry to say that I don't think it's safe for you to go back to Baron anymore. The guards clearly don't recognize who you are, but now you're on their radar as an intruder. As am I. But I had an idea,
Theodore protested.
We just need to find someone in the village that would be willing to let us use a boat, and...
Shh! The hooded man suddenly hissed, and Theodore clamped his mouth shut. The chocobo was approaching the entrance to Mist Cave, and standing in front of it was... another soldier. The hooded man stopped the chocobo, who skidded to a halt and let out a warbling cry. The man hopped down from the bird and offered his hand to Theodore, but Theodore swung his legs clumsily and fell off on his own. Groaning as he picked himself back up, Theodore followed the hooded man to the cave entrance. The soldier who was standing guard looked at them, but didn't reach for his sword, which seemed promising.
Excuse me?
Theodore began, but the soldier shook his head.
No one may pass. Orders from the king.
Theodore put his hands on his hips, all pretense of politeness falling by the wayside.
Why not? There's no way my father would give a decree like that. No one may pass. Orders from the king. Grr.
Theodore growled, taking a step forward to force his way through, but the hooded man pulled him aside.
All right.
He unsheathed his blade, pointing it toward the soldier while holding out one arm to keep Theodore back.
Hey!
Theodore cried, but the hooded man shook his head.
Brace yourself, Theodore.
The soldier's lips twisted into an odd smirk, and a peal of high-pitched laughter released into the air as a cloud of violet smoke suddenly enveloped him, the same rich color as his dragoon armor. Theodore tried to wave the smoke away, and had to stop himself from screaming when he saw what now stood before them instead, a half-stallion, half-human beast, with silver plate armor on its top human half, and silver-brown equestrian haunches that made up its lower half, a centaur knight. Its human arm was raised high in the air with an unsheathed blade, poised to crash down upon the hooded man's head.
Ha!
The hooded man gasped, bringing his sword up just in time to block the blow. Theodore withdrew his blade, taking the opportunity to run it through the closest of the monster's forethigh while it was distracted. As blood began to gush from the wound, the hooded man shoved the centaur knight back with his sword, causing the monster to stagger. The leg Theodore had injured gave out, and the centaur knight collapsed to the ground, hissing behind its burgonet helmet and dropping its sword.
Now, Theodore!
The hooded man shouted, and they both drove their blades into the vulnerable lower half of the beast, the hooded man smashing his boot into the monster's armored face for good measure. Theodore pulled back his blade, wiping the rain from his eyes as he watched the centaur knight bleed out and eventually explode into dust. The dust mixed with the rain rushing down upon them, creating a murky, clay-like substance that slowly drained into the ground. Theodore bent down wordlessly, noticing that the monster's sword had not disappeared along with the rest of him. When he picked up the blade, he felt as if something bitter had been pressed upon his tongue. It was standard issue from the Baronian armory, a silver and crimson broadsword that bared the Baronian crest in the pommel. When he held it next to his own sword, the one his father had given him from his own days as a Red Wing, he saw they were exactly the same. Dropping the soldier's sword in the muddled remains of the monster, Theodore looked away.
He was a soldier that was turned into a monster. I figured as much,
the hooded man said quietly.
You get a sense for these things, after a while, if you spend enough time with things that aren't human.
Theodore looked up at him, biting down on his lip.
Do you think the other soldiers in Baron Castle are like that too?
The hooded man didn't reply. It wasn't just the other soldiers in Baron that Theodore had to worry about. But of course, he couldn't tell him that. In lieu of answering, he stepped over the discarded sword and entered Mist Cave. Theodore sheathed his sword, whispering a quick prayer for the dead under his breath before following him inside. The Mist Cave was a welcome shelter from the rain, but it was as cold, if not more so, than the ancient waterway, so Theodore quickly began to shiver once again, rubbing his arms in a pathetic effort to keep his blood circulating. He wished more than anything right now that Angela was with them so she could cast a fire spell. His white magic wasn't good for anything like that. Rainwater from outside was dripping steadily in random sections of the path the hooded man had started ahead on, making Theodore wince every time a drop fell on his head. As he skipped up a flight of ancient steps carved into stone that led to a new platform, he felt a tickle in his nose, and let out a loud sneeze. The hooded man stopped and turned around, and right at that moment, a quake rippled through the cave, nearly knocking Theodore backwards back down the stairs. It had only lasted for a few seconds, but it had been powerful.
That wasn't me, was it?
Theodore sniffed, rubbing his nose.
Doubtful,
the hooded man frowned.
Just be careful. We'll get you somewhere warm soon so that you don't catch cold. This cave isn't very deep. It shouldn't be long.
Theodore ran to catch up with the hooded man, noticing that the further they strayed from the cave's entrance, the harder it was getting to see. It wasn't an issue of light, it had been so dark outside that Theodore's eyes had hardly needed to make an adjustment when they had entered the cavern, but a wispy fog had started to obscure the puddles on the floor of the cave, and it seemed to be getting thicker the deeper they went. Theodore crept a few paces closer to the hooded man, not wanting to risk losing sight of him.
Hey!
Theodore began, wondering if he knew about the fog, but another spell of violent shaking interrupted him. This time, it shook the cave so hard that Theodore could hear the sound of rocks crashing down in the distance, bouncing against the cavern walls and then going silent, probably plummeting into oblivion deep below. The hooded man paused, looking around with an uneasy scowl on his face that Theodore didn't like the look of. He turned to Theodore, his hands on his hips.
We need to move quickly. A cave-in down here would be our end. Can you keep up? Okay,
Theodore said, a flush crawling up his cheeks, although he couldn't tell if it was from embarrassment or a blossoming fever.
Sorry for slowing you down. It's not that,
the hooded man frowned.
I'm just watching out for you.
Theodore brushed past the hooded man and proceeded to cross the bridge ahead of them, wrapping his arms around himself to fight off the relentless chill that just didn't seem to go away, no matter how quickly he moved. The sound of rocks falling echoed throughout the cavern again, and Theodore blanched as he felt the bridge shudder beneath him. Time slowed to a crawl, his brain relaying the terrifying sensation of his feet slipping from the damp planks of the bridge in slow motion and flying up into the air, his heart leaping into his throat. His brain hit the fast-forward button, and time sped up once more, sending his body plunging into the darkness below at a dizzying speed.
Ah!
Theodore cried, reaching his hand up helplessly to grab onto something, anything. But it was only seconds later that he slammed into something hard, and stopped falling. Closing his eyes, he let out a low whimper, which was all he could manage from having the wind knocked out of him. From above, he thought he heard someone call his name.
Theodore! Ugh!
What felt like an eternity later, but had only been mere seconds, a loud thump echoed next to Theodore. He opened his eyes and saw the hooded man standing over him, his hair flopping out of the knot at the nape of his neck and falling over his shoulders.
Can you walk?
He asked. Theodore grunted as he hauled himself off the ground, the muscles in his lower back screaming as he first settled onto his knees, and then propped himself onto one foot, and then the next. Taking a hesitant step forward, he gave the hooded man a reluctant smile.
I'm fine.
The man nodded, gesturing toward the winding tunnel that was before them.
Good. Let's start climbing back up.
The tunnel expanded into an open cavern that was filled with glittering stalactites, some of them several feet thick and taller than even some of the houses in Baron, thanks to growing so close together over the millennia that they had eventually merged into one massive, tapered sculpture. All Theodore could do was imagine what a colossal cave-in there would be if even one of them decided to break off and crash into the ground below. It would have made the quakes they had experienced up above seem like a gust of wind. Cutting across the chasm of the chamber that the stalactites lived in was a massive wooden bridge that would take them to a new tunnel. Theodore looked up at the hooded man questioningly.
Someone has actually been down here and built all this? I thought perhaps we had found an unexplored portion of the cave. I as well,
the hooded man blinked.
Although, this bridge looks positively ancient, it must have been built a long time ago, long before either of our ancestors probably existed. I suppose it wouldn't surprise me if people once lived down here. They would have had to live somewhere to escape from monsters before the concept of a village or a city as we know them had been invented. I can't believe there was something that even you didn't know about this cave,
Theodore teased as they started to cross the bridge.
Everywhere we have been so far, you've seemed to know how to navigate with near perfection. Did you used to travel a lot?
Used to? The hooded man smiled thoughtfully.
What makes you think I still don't? I don't know.
Theodore blushed.
Because when we met, I was selling a fishing pole to be able to afford food and looked like a rogue.
The hooded man smirked, and Theodore looked away.
I never said. I'm just giving you a hard time, he said, shaking his head. Now that I know you're a prince, it's much more amusing for me to do so. About that.
Theodore sighed.
I'm sorry about not telling you before. What happened in Baron? That wasn't how I wanted it to come out. But whenever I meet someone new, and they find out I'm a prince, I never know if they're being nice to me because they want to, or because they feel like they have to be. When I met you after the accident, you were kind to me without knowing who I was, and I should have told you the truth right away. But I was also scared, because I didn't know what was happening in Baron. I thought it best to keep my affiliation with the royal family as quiet as possible, given the circumstances. Theodore, the hooded man shook his head, you don't owe me an explanation. I'm sorry if I reacted in a way that made you feel like that. It was clever of you to keep that particular facet of your identity to yourself. After all, you didn't know who I was.
But I still don't. Theodore thought. Yet here I am, with my life essentially in your hands. Why is that? After crossing to the other side of the chasm, they were met with another tunnel that had a rather sharp incline. But in the darkness, Theodore could see a faint blue glow awaiting them at the summit. He pointed up eagerly.
What do you think that is? It looks like the light certain crystals will emit to deter monsters.
The hooded man tapped his chin.
If that's the case, that may be a good place to rest before we continue on. I don't think we're in any danger of being found all the way down here.
They proceeded to climb up the tunnel. Perhaps long ago there had been footholds to help steady whoever would regularly trample back and forth upon it, but time and continuous erosion thanks to the water and mist that had infiltrated the cavern had made just walking up the tunnel nearly impossible. Near the top, the incline was so steep that Theodore had to flatten his body to the rocky floor and pull himself up with his hands and feet so that he didn't hit his head on the ceiling. But once he had finally reached the top, he was able to stand up fully once more. The cavern had opened back up, and he found himself under a dome that was pitch black, save for the aqua-green glow of hundreds of pulsing lights that were clinging to the ceiling and the walls. At his feet were the blue crystals that the hooded man had predicted were the cause of the light they had originally spotted from the bottom of the tunnel, arranged in a circle around a darkened, depressed portion of the floor that had perhaps once been used as a fire pit.
Whoa!
Theodore gasped, turning in a slow circle to take in the celestial view.
It feels like we're in space.
The hooded man hauled himself up over the ledge, pushing his cloak back from his head as he looked up in awe. He noticed that the green lights ended in a distinct line about a foot away from the circle of crystals on the ground, and got thicker and brighter the closer they got to the ceiling. Gossamer threads of silk could be seen crossing between some of the brighter clumps of light, creating miniature hammocks of white star bursts.
I think this is an octoluca nest, the hooded man said. I thought these had gone extinct. What's an octoluca?
Theodore blinked, plopping down on the ground.
A monster,
the hooded man began, and Theodore scrambled back up to his feet, eyes wide. The man gave him a look, and pointed back down to the floor. Theodore reluctantly sat back down, and he continued.
It's a cousin of larva. Do you know what those are?
Yes, Theodore shuddered, remembering the gross squishing and popping noises they had made under his hands when he crawled through the last tunnel of the Adamant Isle grotto to reach the Knight's Emblem.
So, relatively harmless, then. Yes. These all appear to be mostly eggs. Even though they are clearly repelled by these crystals here.
He nodded toward the crystals on the floor.
I think they are also simultaneously attracted to the light. The light of the crystals is reflecting off the Noctiluca, and vice versa. It's really quite beautiful. It is.
Theodore smiled.
Kind of makes you feel like you are sitting under the stars on a really clear night.
They sat together in silence, their attention captured by the scintillating light show. In the distance, the steady, but soothing drip of the cavern runoff could be heard echoing softly, pleaing, pleaing, pleaing. The hooded man reached up, pulling a tattered navy blue ribbon from his hair and proceeding to comb his fingers through the wet strands that had fallen loose over his shoulders. Theodore glanced over at him, feeling an unexpected pang of homesickness. His waist-length blonde hair was strangely reminiscent of his mother's. He looked up and saw Theodore staring, offering a small smile.
To answer your question from before. Yes, I used to travel a lot, when I was in the military. I've always been interested in geography too, it helped me strategize on missions. I've been all over the world, but I'm not so old that I've yet seen everything. The only thing I know for sure is that our planet still has many secrets we have yet to uncover. You were in the military too?
Theodore asked, perking up a bit at having something in common.
I left when the war ended. My family was long gone before any of the fighting broke out, so I was fortunate in that regard. When it was all over, I decided it was a good time to start over with my life. I thought I would try honing my skills as a survivalist to give myself a challenge. I just happened to be in the Mysidia region at the time when I found you.
The man looked back up at the ceiling, scooping his hair back into a ponytail.
Were any of your friends in the accident? No.
Theodore shook his head, stifling a sigh.
I mean, I wasn't in the Red Wings long enough to make any friends. I don't really have any at all. No one really wants to be friends with a prince. Why not? I wish I truly knew, but I can only guess. My mother sent me to school in the village, so that I would be with kids my own age and not locked up with the usual castle citizenry. But when I would approach people, they were too shy to talk to me, or some accused me of taking pity on them. Eventually, I just gave up. My parents' friends were always kind to me when they would visit, but otherwise, it was just easier to keep to myself. My parents don't understand, they grew up as commoners.
The hooded man nodded thoughtfully.
Are there any other royals you know that are close to your age? Just Princess Ursula Leiden, of Fabul.
Theodore frowned.
She's nice, but I can tell she doesn't really like me. I think she just puts up with me because Cecil is her godfather, and she adores him. I just get this feeling every time we see each other that she just wants to kick my backside from Baron to Fabul and back again.
The hooded man laughed so hard that he doubled over as he reached for his ribbon.
If she's from Fabul, it means she's a monk, right? So I suppose that is entirely possible. I don't know if she is really a monk,
Theodore shrugged.
I know you have to go through special training for that, and it's not like she tells me anything that's going on with her life. All I know is that she is seriously scary.
The hooded man burst into laughter again, reaching up to wipe a tear from his eye after wrapping his hair into a knot and securing the ribbon around it.
Tell me about your parents. You said in the Devil's Road that you didn't want to be known for your bloodline. Do you get a lot of attention because of their accomplishments during the war?
Theodore leaned his cheek against his hand.
Everyone thinks I need to be just like my father. Strong, noble, and he always knows the right thing to do. It's like he never has to think about anything, he can just make a decision and it will be the right one. It's a big deal in Baron that he's a paladin. The only one in the world, as far as anyone knows. So people think you should become a paladin too. Yes,
Theodore nodded. He gets it.
It was one of the last things my second lieutenant said to me before he died. That he couldn't wait to see me become a paladin like Cecil. I was so upset, for a multitude of reasons. That people just assumed that was what I wanted. The realization that my father never even told me how he became a paladin. I know he had a trial, but he's never said more than that.
The hooded man raised his eyebrows.
Oh really?
Theodore nodded again.
There's a lot of stuff about the war my parents don't talk about. They've told me a lot of stories, of course. And I've overheard a lot of stuff from when their friends used to come by. But I think there are some things that make them too sad to remember. Sometimes I catch my father gazing at the moon, and there's this despondent look on his face that I can't decipher. And every year, my mother will make a pilgrimage to Fabul to pray to the Crystal of Wind. It's not really a secret, but it's not publicized, either. She prays for the winds to protect her and my father's best friend, who disappeared after the war, so that he can come home safely. He was a dragoon, so she thinks he has the strongest affinity to wind. That's how my mother has always been. Kind, patient, and always optimistic, no matter how dark things get. I know people wonder why I'm not showing the talent in white magic that she had when she was my age. But she never pressures me. She just tells me that all blessings come when a person is ready to receive them.
Theodore pulled his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around his legs and propping his chin upon them.
She always sees the best in everyone. Even when they don't deserve it.
He didn't notice that the hooded man had pulled his cloak back up again, his face half hidden in the shadows cast by the light above.
Theodore,
he said softly,
I know that it's hard to grow up in someone's shadow. Maybe you're not looking for advice, but you have to stop comparing yourself to your parents. You can't change the circumstances under which you were brought into this world, but you can change your perception of those circumstances. What do you mean?
Theodore blinked.
What I mean is, you, and the rest of the world, have your parents upon this pedestal. You've painted this untouchable image of them to intimidate yourself, but they are still just human beings. You should get to really know your parents, ask them questions that you're afraid to get the answers to instead of just assuming you know everything they're thinking. You're old enough now to understand the emotion behind some of the decisions they've had to make. Maybe you wouldn't make the same choices they did, but at least being able to understand why that is would be the first step in truly achieving the autonomy you crave. In the end, all that's going to matter is if you're happy with who you are. It is best that you understand sooner rather than later that the expectations others have of you are far less important than the expectations you have for yourself.
Theodore closed his eyes, clutching his legs tighter.
But how am I supposed to do any of that? All my life, I've just been told where to go and what to do. It wasn't what I always wanted, but it was easy. Maybe gain a little confidence first,
the hooded man frowned, jutting out a finger.
And start taking responsibility, like you did in Baron. The easy choice would have been for you to just go back with those guards when they came after us, right? Yes, I told you to run. I even took your hand and pulled you along with me. But you gained your own footing, and instead of falling back, you kept running on your own. I did.
Theodore mumbled into his arms. The man covered his mouth just as a yawn escaped. He was starting to get a better understanding of why Theodore had his panic attack in Baron. The poor kid's heart was being pulled in multiple, conflicting directions.
I think that's enough talking for now. Let's get a little rest, and we'll continue on. Does that sound good to you?
But Theodore had already fallen asleep sitting up. A few hours later, the hooded man shook Theodore awake. In the distance, the quaking sound could be heard again. And it was even louder than it had been before Theodore fell off the bridge. Whatever making it was much closer to them down here than it had been on the surface.
Theodore! Wake up!
Theodore's eyes snapped open, his heart beating wildly.
What?
Shh! The hooded man hissed, pointing to the west. Theodore blinked and followed his finger. To get to the next chamber, they had merely needed to follow the tunnel that led away from the Noctiluca nest, which was thankfully leveled off in comparison to the tunnel they had needed to climb up in. The chamber was dimly lit, too, which he assumed meant it was closer to where they had originally started on the surface level of the cave. But even in the failing light, Theodore could see that something was wrong. Small rocks were pouring down from whatever was above the lit chamber and crashing into the cavern floor. Another loud quake erupted, and Theodore gasped, covering his ears to keep them from ringing.
It's close,
he cried.
Exactly,
the hooded man nodded.
We've got to get through before something cuts us off. I'm ready,
Theodore said, climbing to his feet. The hooded man followed suit, and they both started running through the tunnel toward the exit that would take them into the chamber. Upon entry, Theodore could see blankets of mist hanging above them, and a set of ascending stone stairs. But the tremors tore through again, so intensely this time that both men fell to the ground. Theodore's voice rattled as his body was thrashed about.
It's SS shaking even harder now.
Theodore gasped, trying to gain his footing.
But where is it CC coming from?
The hooded man grunted.
It feels like we're DD directly above it.
Large cracks began to bloom in the floor between the two of them, spreading so quickly that Theodore couldn't scramble to his feet fast enough. Even the hooded man was having trouble regaining his balance. Theodore realized if something wasn't done fast, they would be swallowed into a massive sinkhole. A piece of the floor broke off underneath his feet, and Theodore closed his eyes, clasping his hands together as he forced every neutron in his body to imagine himself and his companion soaring into the air.
Float.
Just as the floor completely collapsed underneath them, pouring hundreds of pounds of rubble into the abyss below, Theodore felt the tug of the angel wings that had formed on his shoulder blades, pulling him to safety. The hooded man was hovering as well, staring at Theodore with a look of shock that was strangely satisfying.
Let's get out of here.
Theodore smiled, turning and starting to kick his levitating feet toward the stairs.
Theodore, look out!
The hooded man cried. Theodore turned around just in time to see a dark shadow fall over him, a dark shadow that had 20 squirming legs, and a pair of razor-sharp, clacking pincers. Theodore lifted his buckler, just barely managing to block whatever it was that struck him, sending him flying backward away from the pit, bouncing off the ground a few times before coming to a stop mid-air thanks to the float spell.
Ugh!
Theodore moaned, pushing himself up and shaking his head. When his vision came into focus, he saw the hooded man exchanging blows with a towering navy, hard-shelled centipede that had crawled out of the sinkhole. It was surely the creature that had been causing all of the quakes throughout the cavern. It looked like it could chew through a pile of rocks with those pincers like a child on a sugar high tearing through candy.
Theodore! Are you okay? Yeah.
Theodore reached down, withdrawing his sword.
Here I come.
He dodged the monster's thrashing tail and brought his blade down across its back, making one quick slash and twisting his body around to do another, carving a green, oozing, but shallow X into its flesh. The hooded man swung his sword high over his head, striking with so much force that both of the monster's pincers were severed. That would least take away one weapon it could use against them.
If we hit at the same time, we can try to cleave its exoskeleton.
The man cried.
But we need to try to strike the exact spot from opposite sides. The abdomen would be best. On the count of 3.
Theodore asked, and the man nodded.
1. 2.
The monster writhed angrily, twisting away from the hooded man so that it faced Theodore, spraying hot spittle and gods knew what else from the gaping wound on its maw. Theodore closed his eyes and tried to swipe the burning liquid from his skin, feeling tears prick in the corners of his eyes.
3. Ah!
Theodore screamed, propelling himself forward half-blind and throwing all of his weight behind his sword. He felt the exoskeleton crack underneath as the blade wriggled in, and nearly jumped in surprise as the tip of the hooded man's blade suddenly emerged from the other side, finishing the job. Their swords came loose as the top half of the monster split from the bottom half, its thrashing spraying the green liquid everywhere as both parts disappeared down the sinkhole, swallowed by darkness. Theodore gagged from the smell of whatever had gotten on him and rubbed his face with his scarf before casting Cura on the two of them. The magic soothing light lifted the burning sensation from Theodore's skin, and when he opened his eyes again, he felt good as new. The chamber was a complete wreck. The hole in the center of the room had nearly spread across the entire length of the cave floor, leaving very little room for one to shuffle through in order to cross to the other side, but the stairs were still intact.
You all right?
The hooded man sheathed his sword.
That was fast thinking with the float spell. I'm fine.
Theodore grinned.
I was able to just picture the spell end. It happened, the first time that has ever worked for me. Do you think that thing was the inhabitant of this cave?
The man nodded and glanced toward the stairway.
I'd say so. This time, at least.
Theodore blinked. Once they safely glided over the sinkhole to reach the stairs, Theodore cast Dispel to remove the effects of float from their bodies so they could walk properly. Upon closer inspection, the stairs were strewn with piles of rubble. The wall at the top of the stairs had half collapsed, creating a narrow exit for that they could squeeze through if they pressed their backs to the wall and slid out. As Theodore broke free, he realized with excitement that he could see light, actual pools of golden sunlight, pouring into the cave from an opening to the north. The storm had finally passed over them.
We made it back to the surface!
Theodore exclaimed. But as he started to run, he heard hurried footsteps and voices, and froze in place.
Theodore!
The hooded man hissed. He grabbed the boy and pulled him down to the ground, diving behind another pile of rubble that had crashed down from the entryway they had emerged from being split open. 3 Baronian soldiers emerged from the sunlight, their long shadows trailing so close that Theodore could have reached out and touched them.
They must have come through here. They must not escape. Orders from the king.
The hooded man clenched his jaw, whispering,
There they are.
Theodore heard yet more footsteps, and spotted another group of soldiers to their left, crossing the bridge he had fallen from.
Over there, too. Damn. We're surrounded.
The hooded man shrank further down in the rubble, but he knew it would only be matter of time until he was spotted. Theodore was small enough that he could probably stay hidden, but he was far too tall. He was mentally starting to calculate the best plan of attack. Did he ambush them and hope that it would be enough of a distraction for Theodore to stay hidden until it was all over?
What should we do?
Theodore looked up at him worriedly.
There's no way out.
As both groups of soldiers approached rapidly, Theodore felt a biting chill wrap around his body. He bit his lip as he shivered, pulling his scarf further up over his mouth as quietly as possible. The pale mist that had been drifting along the floor of the cavern had begun to rapidly multiply and rise. The hooded man looked around confusedly, and saw that he could now barely make out the soldiers' approach.
What they? The mist is thickening.
Theodore hissed behind his scarf.
Keep quiet.
The man pressed his finger to his lips. The guards met up with each other, 6 in total, unknowingly only steps away from their prey.
Where are they?
One of them asked, in the same flat voice all of the other soldiers they had encountered thus far had been using.
They weren't in mist, either.
Another one shook his head.
So that means they must be somewhere close to Baron.
The soldiers all nodded in unison, and proceeded to march the opposite direction, back toward the entrance to the cave. When their footsteps had fallen away, Theodore and the hooded man emerged from their hiding place, watching silently as the mist began to dissipate before their eyes.
The mist.
It saved us, Theodore whispered, raising his hands and gently trailing his fingers through the foggy remnants that still clung to the air.
How can that be?
The hooded man crossed his arms over his chest, looking down in thought. Theodore turned to him, dropping his hands to his sides.
What is it? Oh. Nothing.
He shook his head, and shrugged.
Let's move before they come back again.
Bursting outside, Theodore let out an exalted cheer, leaping into the air and pumping his fist toward the late afternoon sun. The sky was the same perfect blue as it had been when they left Mysidia, and every trace of the clouds that had overpowered the sky had been swept away. Not too far in the distance, Theodore could see a tiny village. He could only make out a few small dwellings and a cluster of trees. There wasn't a gate, or even a post in the worn meadow path with a sign that said where they were. On either side of the meadow, they were surrounded by the violet-gray mountains of northern Baron, some of the highest peaks snow-capped even in the summer.
That's mist ahead of us, right?
Theodore asked, and the hooded man nodded.
That's right. I thought the mountain east of the village had caved in.
Theodore blinked.
So are we just hiding out here? Nap. We're going to take advantage of the cave-in.
The man grinned, and Theodore's face fell.
Hey. They wouldn't expect a couple of fugitives to head that way, I would imagine. Fugitives?
Theodore blanched.
We're walking right into a collapsed mountain. That's exactly right.
The hooded man started to walk ahead, and Theodore bit down on his lip.
Wait a minute.
There had been something that was bothering Theodore ever since they left the Noctiluca nest, and he decided it was time to take some of his companion's advice and start asking some questions. The hooded man stopped, but didn't turn around. Theodore took a few steps forward, raising his chin and standing up straighter, like he would have done if he were addressing Captain Biggs.
Tell me. Why are you doing all this for me?
The hooded man whirled around after a few beats, one hand on his hip. His ice blue eyes locked onto Theodore's, and the prince couldn't help but shrink back in fear. He had never seen such a cold stare in his life. The lifeless guard's eyes at Baron Castle had been frightening, but to see such intense fury manifest so suddenly before his very eyes. It was like he was looking at a stranger and not the savior who had been the only good part about the worst 2 days of his life.
I'm not doing this for you,
he said curtly. Theodore blinked, but couldn't bring himself to respond. The man's eyes had still not left his, and he found himself paralyzed.
There's a man I'm after. Someone I have to annihilate, even if it costs me my own life. A man.
Theodore finally managed to choke out. He could feel his body breaking into a cold sweat, his pulse slowing so abruptly that he thought he might pass out right there in the meadow. "I've been accompanying someone on an assassination mission this whole time. And his target was a man that he thought could be in Baron?" Theodore remembered with a nauseating twist of his stomach his observation of how keen the hooded man had been to help Theodore get inside Baron Castle, and how he had also left him alone within for a brief time. Oh gods! Was he looking for father?
"Who is he?"
Theodore whispered. Silence, again. The hooded man's eyes finally left Theodore, and he glared at the ground, drilling the toe of his boot into a dandelion that was instantly torn asunder, falling limply to the ground to die. He turned his back to the boy, tilting his head toward the horizon.
"A dragoon. Ex-Baron."
Theodore felt as if all of the oxygen had been sucked out of the misty valley. When he parted his lips, he found that he couldn't even will his lungs to draw in a breath. He took a reluctant step forward, cringing at how loud his footsteps sounded in the sudden wall of silence that had been erected between them.
"Hey! His name wouldn't be..."
Theodore swallowed a lump of acid that had bubbled up from his stomach.
"Cane Highwind."
But the man needed not reply. Theodore could see the muscles in his left forearm visibly constrict when the name fell from his lips, his eyes drifting down to see that the hooded man was clenching his fist. The man's hand was shaking so hard that Theodore was afraid he would crush his own fingers. "The man who saved my life wants to murder my parents' missing best friend." End of chapter.